Hello, and thank you so much for attending our talk today. I'm Mary, and I'm the Teaching and Learning Librarian at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. And my co-presenter is Sandra Cowan, who is a liaison librarian at the University of Lethbridge in Southern Alberta. Sandra and I have been thinking about and discussing the ideas we will share with you today over the past few years. Admittedly, most of what we will say is very aspirational and nothing is conclusive. And we really hope that we will hear from you at the conclusion of this talk about your ideas on love and compassion. Take it away, Sandra.
Thanks. So I'm going to start with compassion. Compassion is often translated as suffering with compassion. It's the complex, universal human capacity to recognize and empathize with the pain and discomfort of others, combined with the wish to alleviate their pain. It's generally other-focused, shifting our focus from a self-centered attitude to an other-centered perspective, although self-compassion is certainly also a category of compassion. Compassion is a quality that can be cultivated. The discussion of practices that train in compassion or cultivate compassion is beyond the scope of this talk today, but there are ways to train the brain or train the heart-mind to be more compassionate. The practice of compassion causes actual changes to the brain that can actually make you feel more positive emotions and feel more connected. So in a sense, all compassion practice is also self-compassion. There's considerable evidence that the cultivation of compassion increases altruism and pro-social behavior, which improves relationships and increases emotional well-being and happiness, both in the people around the compassionate person and, importantly, in the person who practices compassion as well. Whether we think of self-compassion or compassion towards our communities or in our workplaces, this cognitive and emotional quality can be cultivated to encourage caring, warm-heartedness, generosity, and well-being in self and other. In this way, compassion can be thought of as a component of community and individual wellness. It is undeniable that academic librarianship is relational work, and so it seems logical that compassion could be a benefit in our work and in our work communities. There has been a lot of research on compassion in wellness fields like nursing and psychotherapy, but if we think of librarianship as a care-based profession, compassion is also relevant in the library. There's evidence that the work of librarians includes compassion, even if it's not always named as such. For example, in a 2021 study by Williams and Ogden, they found that librarians dealing with people in crisis were very aware of the fact that they recognized others' suffering, and they purposely thought about what the other person might be going through in a non-judgmental way. To quote from the study, even with patrons who could cause trouble for the librarians, empathic understanding was the rule rather than the exception. I always try to remember that there's probably a lot going on with them, and so it's not a personal attack. Williams and Ogden also found that librarians generally felt moved to help in any way that they could, through kindness, listening, providing information, directing to resources, or even providing first aid. And another quote, several of the librarians identified the importance of developing relationships with patrons as part of the service they provided. Relationships could be the needed help. Librarians needed to provide whatever help they could, from Narcan to housing assistance, so that they could be at peace with their choices. So it's clear that there is compassion at play in libraries, in the recognition of suffering and the desire to help. It may seem like a professional norm to develop compassion towards our patrons and our students, but what about our coworkers and administrators? We affect and are affected by the people we work with daily, and this is where I think compassion is most needed in academic libraries. As Kendrick detailed in her phenomenological study of low morale experience of academic librarians, In the workplace of academic libraries, there can be emotional, verbal, and systemic abuse, including toxic work environments, microaggressions, bullying, and other unsupportive behavior. This can cause mental, emotional, and even physical suffering among library workers. Kendrick found that those who had experienced some form of workplace abuse often increased their commitment to compassion, particularly if they moved on to managerial positions. And to quote from her study, respondents indicated that their own empathy and compassion for others increased as a result of the low morale experience. If participants became supervisors or administrators, their low morale experience prompted them to reflect on and adjust their leadership style to one that highlighted compassion, flexibility, acknowledgement of employee contributions, and a significantly reduced tolerance for abuse. If there is one thing that I would advocate for, it's practicing compassion with our coworkers. A kinder workplace is an important component of wellness for everyone concerned. Compassion practice also seems to offer protection from empathy fatigue, from negativity contagion, and even from burnout, whether these arise from working with patrons or dealing with toxic interactions with coworkers. According to Bibeau and his colleagues in their phenomenological study of psychotherapists, compassion meditation, they said, helps them be more sensitive and yet less prone to emotional contagion. Practicing compassion has been shown to decrease the recovery time from stress as well, another protective measure that enhances wellness. There's also a mirror energy effect. Another quote, radiating compassion to the coworkers will also reactively elicit compassionate responses. Compassion may be contagious. Although it is not easy to change institutional culture that is based on top-down power structures and competition, as most academic institutions I know of are, it might be possible for compassion to begin to change it from within, creating a healthier work environment for everyone.
Okay, now we're going to switch gears a little bit to love. So it seems that talk of love is everywhere, including in our discussions of libraries and library work. In particular, I've noticed in the last little while during the current Great Resignation, so-called Great Resignation, there is the idea that your work won't love you back. So building on the concepts that Sandra has mentioned about compassion in the workplace, I'd like to assert that being compassionate can also be understood as being loving toward each other in the workplace. Taking their cues from the work of the Feminist Love Studies Network and Jonas Daughter, pardon me, in particular, Greenshields and Polkinghorne call for a feminist exploration of love in the work of information scientists and offer examples from the field. Their work suggests ways of weaving love into information science workspaces as a way to use love and its power to create, quote, a more welcoming and heterogeneous discipline. The original conception of love power comes from Jonas Daughter, who sees love as a creative, productive, and exploitable human capacity, comparable in significance to labor or labor power. And that is a quote from Jonas Daughter. There are strong ties to the idea of love power also in the work of Sloniowski, Alison Casson, and others who examine the gender division of labor in information science, and Wilson's work on information behavior and the affective experiences of early career academics. Next slide, please. I would assert that the work of librarians and professionals in other feminized care-focused professions, such as nursing, social work, and psychotherapy, includes the use of love and compassion. Care work, love, and compassion are intertwined. Some are drawn to these types of professions because they gain satisfaction from practicing caring and compassion. They enjoy helping people. Compassion can be viewed as essential to academic librarians in their work with patrons, teaching, creating balanced, accessible collections for the public good, and in their interactions with each other and other work colleagues. In particular, I advocate for the use of love and love power amongst colleagues at work. The modern neoliberal university, and by extension the library, is a site of what Hooks has deemed the white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, part of the, quote, interlocking systems of domination that define our reality. These systems of domination ensure individualism, competition, and separateness. The goals of intersectional feminism, of which Feminist Love Studies is a part, alluded to by Hooks in her work, particularly collectivism, cooperation, and equity, run opposite to the features of the modern university. However, distinct areas of feminist scholarship have emerged to provide suggestions as to ways to remake our world into one that prizes a diversity of viewpoints, experiences, practices, and contributions. So in this particular situation, we're thinking more of the bigger structures rather than the individual. Educational institutions are frequently referred to as commons, and their libraries have adopted such language when they are renamed knowledge commons or learning commons. This considered naming evokes an egalitarian, every person space where knowledge is shared and learning occurs for everyone. Feminist theorist Federici's work proposes the commons as a countermeasure to a society ruled by the state and the market, and specifically in the university as overcoming, quote, the hierarchies existing within it on the basis of its division of labor. Her work echoes Ahmed as it calls for feminism to prioritize, quote, opposing the divisions that capitalism has created on the basis of race, gender, and age, reuniting what has separated in our lives and reconstituting a collective interest. So those are some of the goals that we think that could be achieved perhaps through compassion and love in the workplace. In her excellent research on immaterial effective labor in academic libraries, Slaniewski asserts that libraries can be understood as an extension of the domestic sphere, and librarianship a form of waged domestic labor, that they are, quote, procreative spaces, and that librarians' immaterial labor is stratified by gender. Mind work is more valued than emotional labor, inherent in teaching or reference work. As Shirazi explains, credentialed librarians also suffer a dual hurdle in overcoming genderized assumptions and differential credentialing in academia. As Sandra has suggested, librarianship also seems to suffer from workplace dynamics that may be considered toxic. This is not to say that libraries are worse than other workplaces. It is more a matter of them being the places in which we both work and the places in which we have experienced these sorts of environments. All right, Sandra, it's back to you.
Although compassion and love can both help create a healthier workplace, the potential for unhelpful compassion in the form of niceness or enabling addictive or harmful behavior exists in the term idiot compassion, coined by the Buddhist teacher Chogyam Trungpa. Idiot compassion can be found in the tendency to give people what they want because you don't want to see them suffer, or in order to prevent yourself from suffering, or in order to avoid conflict. As Chogyam Trungpa wrote, it is perhaps most important in working with others that we do not develop idiot compassion, which means always trying to be kind. Since this superficial kindness lacks courage and intelligence, it does more harm than good. It is as though a doctor, out of apparent kindness, refuses to treat his patient because the treatment might be painful. Idiot compassion can also show up in the facade of compassion or in forced or false niceness, a lack of healthy boundaries, or in the inability to say no. Another example of idiot compassion can be the attempt to idealize compassion as part of professional identity or imperative. As McCaffrey says about idiot compassion, attempts to essentialize and idealize compassion risk losing sight of the event of compassion in favor of moral exhortation. For example, I could interpret some of the following things that I've experienced in academic libraries as idiot compassion. The tendency to never say no, to try to always be all things to all people. the proliferation of services and roles that may be beyond our scope or capacity, but are often taken on in order to prove our value within the academy or to appease upper administrators, and also often taken on alongside decreases in staffing and resourcing. The niceness expectation, which I think is linked to professional identity in some healthy ways, as Mary referred to, but it also seems tied to proving our worth through agreeableness and affective service in a context where libraries are not valued intrinsically. I think we are pressured by a moral and professional exhortation to act out of a kind of compassion that may not be genuine. The McMindfulness critique points out the way that corporatized institutions promote individual contemplative practices, such as mindfulness practices, as a means of improving work outcomes or profits, as well as a means to shift responsibility for wellness onto the individual worker and deflect responsibility from institutional and systemic causes of mental and physical ill health. As compassion becomes more mainstream, a similar compassion movement may arise. I think we need to ask whether compassion as a motive, a practice, and even a professional identity among librarians is liable to be exploited by the institutions that we work within. One way to consider creating a more compassionate community in our libraries is through compassionate thinking, as opposed to threat-based thinking. This is similar to feminist and feminized professionalism that Mary discussed earlier, and it could be a way of thinking that helps shift the workplace from individualized competition towards compassionate commons. While threat-based thinking judges and blames, compassionate thinking seeks to understand what is happening, why it is happening, and what can be done about it. Threat-based thinking is defensive or competitive in nature and generates hostility towards perceived threats. It is focused on proving ourselves right to avoid feeling vulnerable or embarrassed. As Chogyam Trungpa said, unlike idiot compassion, real compassion is not based on a simple-minded avoidance of pain. Real compassion is intelligent and direct in addressing the problems that cause suffering. As Colson and Children said, whereas threat-based thinking is narrow, biased, and tightly focused, compassionate thinking is broad and flexible. We're able to consider and understand the situation from different perspectives. Compassionate thinking can move back and forth between empathizing and problem solving, between directing warmth and acceptance to those who are suffering and seeking pragmatic solutions to address the causes and conditions that create and maintain that suffering. Compassionate thinking involves both understanding and action.
So thank you very much for listening to us today. We recognize that we are presenting an idealized picture of possible worlds. What we hope you can take away from this are different frameworks with which to think about the ways we work and relate to each other. There are no easy answers, but perhaps by prioritizing love and compassion, academic libraries could be workplaces that take better care of our wellness. And before we get into the questions, we did have a question for you from us. So it's right here on our slide, and it is, what are some solutions for promoting a more compassionate, loving workplace? And I think that we will just, for the purposes of this recording, we'll just advance here to the end, and then we will meet you in the reel to hear your answers to this question.